Right guys, welcome to this brief video on culture bias. As usual, we are going to cover the outline elements of the topic first, with a focus on a brief recap of universality, because we covered it in the gender bias lesson. We're then going to have a look at what culture bias is, and we're going to have a look at the two key terms that you need to know for this topic: ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. We'll then move on to the evaluation points, and I've got 4 of those for you. If you're interested in some of the exam questions that you could get for this topic, including essay practice, you can click on the link at the top of the screen now and you can head over to the exam practice video. And before we get started, if you find this video useful, please let me know by hitting the like button. So, here are the 4 key terms for the topic. You've got culture bias, which is the obvious one, universality, which, like I said, we'll have a quick revisit of, and then you've got ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, just so that you can keep an eye out for them as we go through the video. Now, in our previous video on gender bias, we introduced the concept of universality and bias, and we discussed how, if psychology is a scientific study of human behavior, then it should be standardized, and it should be able to apply to all people. But actually, psychology has been dominated by men for such a long time, and because of that, it's made assumptions about human behavior largely based on male behavior, which produces a gender bias in psychology. We also have a similar bias in respect to culture. So, before we get started, here is a definition of culture bias, which is a tendency to interpret all phenomena through the lens of one's own culture, ignoring the effects that cultural differences might have on behavior. Now, in 2010, Henrik et al. Reviewed hundreds of studies and reported that around 68% of participants came from the USA, and 96% of participants came from industrialized nations. Further research conducted by Arnott in 2008 found that 80% of participants are, or at least were, undergraduates studying psychology. Now, findings like that make us question how universal the findings made by psychologists actually are, and it led to Henrik coining the phrase WEIRD to describe people that are most likely to be studied by psychologists. They are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people. Those are the people who are most likely to be in psychological studies. Now, that suggests that although psychologists routinely claim to have discovered facts about human behavior, those findings are actually subjected to strong cultural bias, because weird people are generally being used in the research. Okay, so we're always using the same type of people from the same type of cultural background in our psychological studies. And of course, that means that, on a similar vein to what we talked about in the gender bias lesson, if the norm or the standard for a particular behavior is set by a specific group of people, in this case, weird people, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people, then the behavior of people from non-Westernized, less educated, agricultural, and poorer cultures is going to be seen as abnormal, inferior, or unusual. Okay, so it's very, very similar to the whole androcentrism issue that we have in gender bias as well. Now, one particular form of culture bias is known as ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is when researchers see and judge other cultures by the standards and the values of their own cultural perspective and assume that their own perspective is normal and correct. In its extreme form, ethnocentrism is the belief in the superiority of one's own culture, which then ultimately can lead to prejudice and discrimination towards other cultures. Okay, ultimately, it is a lack of awareness or even an ignorance towards other people's perspectives of the world. And the findings that were presented by Henrik and Arnott that I mentioned earlier suggests that the US and Europe are guilty of presenting an ethnocentric view of human behavior. Now, as always, you are going to need to have on hand some examples of the things that we talk about here. So, an example of ethnocentric research is Ainsworth's strange situation. And it's often criticized for only reflecting the norms and the values of what's referred to as Western cultures. Okay, so if you remember, in their research, Ainsworth and her colleagues suggested that the ideal attachment was characterized by babies displaying moderate amount of separation and stranger anxiety. Any baby who displayed too little of either of those was deemed as insecure avoidant, whereas any baby who displayed too much of those was deemed as insecure resistant. And ultimately, secure attachment was considered to be the most healthy. However, that then led to a misinterpretation of child-rearing practices in other countries that was seen to deviate from American norms. For example, Japanese babies were much more likely to be classed as insecure resistant because they showed considerable amounts of distress when they were separated from their mothers. However, that is likely to be due to the fact that Japanese babies are rarely separated from their mothers in day-to-day life, which would of course result in extreme distress when they then are separated from them in the strange situation. These babies are presenting as insecure from an American/European perspective, but they're not necessarily presenting as insecure from a perspective of their own culture. If you were to take Japanese culture into account, it is possible that they would be classed as secure by Japanese standards. Okay, but we, Europeans, Americans, we have decided that secure is best, and therefore we are misinterpreting what's going on in other cultures. Cultural relativism, on the other hand, is in many ways the opposite of ethnocentrism. Okay, it's the idea that the norms, the behaviors, the values, the ethics, the moral standards of a particular culture can only be meaningful and can only be understood within the context of the culture in which they appear. So we really need to be in a culture in order to understand that particular culture. Now, an example of cultural relativism in psychology was within intelligence. So back in the mid-80s, Sternberg argued that the meaning of intelligence is different for different cultures. So, for example, coordination and motor skills may be more valued in a pre-literate society. And this is still the case in some tribes around the world, that motor skills and coordination skills are still deemed highly valuable, much more valuable than other skills. However, this isn't the case for a more literate or a more developed society. So therefore, the only way to understand intelligence is to take into account cultural context. If we don't take the context into account, then we run the risk of devaluing other cultures and making assumptions about them that aren't correct, but rather are based on beliefs or stereotypes. For example, we might argue that one culture is less intelligent than our culture, when actually the measure of intelligence that's being used isn't applicable to that culture. Okay, so we can only understand intelligence if we study it from within the culture that we're trying to apply it to. Right, I hope all of that has made sense. That is already the end of the outline. You can see the three main terms on the screen now, and if you want to see how all of those fit into an outline for an essay, then you can head over to the exam practice video, which was linked earlier and will also be linked at the end of the video. Also, I am well aware that some of you will be following the Pink-Haired Girl book for this lesson, and in that book they make reference to emic research and etic research. I am well aware that I haven't talked about that in this video. That's simply because you don't need it for an essay, and also emic versus etic isn't specifically mentioned in the AQA specification, which means that you're not going to get asked a specific question about it. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with learning it, and there's nothing wrong with knowing what it is, and there's nothing wrong with putting it in an essay, but I'm not going to put it in the video because you don't need it. Okay? So let's move on to the evaluation points. Now, before I do that, it's worth mentioning that evaluation points for this topic are not always split into strengths and limitations, but they also look at ways to avoid culture bias, and they also include real-world consequences of culture bias as well. I am going to give you slightly shorter versions of the evaluation points in the video so that I can talk you through them. If you want to find the full written out paragraphs, you can do so in my model essay in the exam practice video. Right, so our first evaluation point is about the real-world consequences of culture bias. Culturally biased research can have significant real-world impacts. For example, they can create prejudice against certain groups of people. Psychologists in America used the opportunity of World War I to pilot their first IQ tests on almost 2 million army recruits. Many of the items on the test were very ethnocentric, so for example, they would assume that everybody knew the names of US presidents, which just wasn't the case. The results from the test were that recruits from Southeastern Europe and African Americans received the lowest scores. Now, the poor performance of those groups wasn't taken as a sign of an inadequate test being performed, but rather it was used to inform racist discourse about the genetic inferiority of particular cultural and ethnic groups. So certain ethnic minorities were deemed as mentally unfit or even feeble-minded in comparison to the white majority, and as a result of that they were denied educational and professional opportunities. Okay, so things like that illustrate how cultural bias can be used to justify prejudice and discrimination towards certain ethnic and cultural groups, and obviously it shows that cultural bias can have very, very damaging real-world consequences. Now, one way to deal with cultural bias is to recognize it when it occurs. So, for example, Smith and Bond found in 1998 in their survey of European textbooks on social psychology that 66% of the studies conducted were American, 32% were European, and only 2% of them were from the rest of the world. Now, that suggests that psychological research is severely unrepresentative, and it can be greatly improved by simply selecting different cultural groups to study. Just by appreciating and understanding cultural bias, we can help psychologists to avoid and overcome the issue of culture bias. Okay, so one way to deal with it is to first recognize it. And to recognize it, we need to be aware of the fact that it does exist. One good thing to have come out of culture bias in psychology is the emergence of indigenous psychology, which focus on the development of different groups of theories in different contexts. An example of that is Afrocentrism, which is a movement suggesting that because all black people have their roots in Africa, theories about them must recognize the African context of behaviors and attitudes. The movement suggests that the values and cultures of Europeans actually devalue non-Europeans, and at the very best are completely irrelevant to them. So this is an example of an approach which emphasizes the uniqueness of every culture and looks at behavior from the inside of a particular system, which is really important because it's led to the emergence of theories that are more relevant to the lives and to the cultures of people not only in Africa, but also those that are far removed from their African origins. Okay, and then we've got a final point, which is a little bit of a discussion point. So many of the studies that have been most influential in psychology have suffered from severe culture bias. But with the rise of globalization in the media, some critics have actually argued that the divide between cultures no longer really applies. So, for example, Ash's results were questioned by Smith and Bond in 1993 as they found evidence to suggest that collectivist cultures had a much higher rate of conformity than individualist cultures. However, more recently, Takano and Osaka in 1999 compared US and Japanese results of an Ash-type experiment, and they found that in 14 out of 15 studies there was no evidence of an individualist-collectivist split. So that suggests that maintaining the distinction between collectivist and individualist is either simplistic and lazy, because cultural differences could actually be much more complicated than to simply say it's all about collectivist and individualist, or it could be that the distinction is actually becoming irrelevant because culture bias may be less of an issue in a modern day psychology than it was in the past. Okay? So you've got 4 evaluation points there. Like I said, I've given you the shortened versions and I've talked you through the points. If you want to see what they look like fully written out and in an essay, then have a look at the exam questions video where you can see all of that. So that brings us to the end of the video. I hope it's all made sense and I hope it's been useful. Head over to the exam practice video for some examples of how it could pop up in an exam and for a model essay as well. If you found it useful, please remember to let me know by hitting the like button. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next one.